In the mid-1930s, the heart of the United States was wounded. The Great Plains region became the stage for one of the greatest ecological disasters in human history. This wasn't just a story of drought. This was a story of human ambition colliding with the forces of nature, upending the lives of millions. Welcome to the Dust Bowl. Our story begins in the 1920s. World War I had ended, and America was experiencing an economic boom. The Great Plains region, a vast area encompassing Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, New Mexico, and Colorado, was known as America's breadbasket. Wheat prices had skyrocketed. Europe had just emerged from war, struggling through hard times and desperate for American grain. For farmers, this was the dawn of a golden age. But there was a critical problem here. The Great Plains had been covered with natural grasslands for thousands of years. Native Americans and bison herds had lived in this delicate ecosystem for centuries. The roots of these grasses formed a natural network that held the soil in place. However, in the 1920s, farmers arrived with tractors and ripped up these grasslands. Millions of acres were converted into wheat fields. The soil was left exposed and defenseless. In 1930, disaster began knocking at the door. At first, the rains diminished. Nobody was worried, dry spells come and go, or so they thought. But this time was different. By 1931, the situation worsened. Crops withered almost completely. Farmers waited hopefully for rain, but it never came. The soil began to crack. And then the wind arrived. Millions of acres of land without ground cover, with destroyed root systems. Now it was just dust. And the constantly blowing strong winds of the Great Plains began lifting this dust into the air. People witnessed black blizzards. Dust clouds that darkened the sky, rising for miles. One farmer described it like this: it felt like the end of the world. Everything turned black, like doomsday had come. April 14, 1935. History would remember this as Black Sunday. The day began with clear, bright skies. People left church, children were playing outside. Then something appeared on the horizon. At first it looked like a cloud, but it was approaching very quickly. It was a massive wall of dust. 10,000 feet high, hundreds of miles wide. Traveling at 60 miles per hour. People ran to their homes. But the dust seeped in from everywhere. Through windows, door cracks, even between the walls. The insides of homes were blanketed with layers of dust. People struggled to breathe. A child recalls, "My mother covered us with wet cloths. Otherwise we would have suffocated. It was dark, it was terrifying. We thought the apocalypse had come." This was just one storm. But hundreds more dust storms occurred throughout the rest of the 1930s. Living in the Dust Bowl was a complete nightmare. Every day was a struggle for survival. Farmers watched their crops die. Animals died from inhaling dust. Cattle and horses collapsed from starvation. Some farmers were forced to shoot their own animals. Housewives cleaned every day, but the dust never stopped. They covered their food, yet still ate dust. Sheets would be coated with dust by morning. A health crisis emerged. Dust pneumonia killed hundreds of people. Children and the elderly were especially at risk. People's lungs were filling with dust. One doctor wrote, "When I listen with a stethoscope, I hear a sound like sandpaper rubbing together." Their lungs are full of dust. Economically, it was a complete catastrophe. The Great Depression that began in 1929 had already hit farmers hard. Now they had no crops either. Banks called in their loans. Thousands of farms were foreclosed. In 1935 and 1936, people began to surrender. The Great Migration began. Approximately 2.5 million people left the Great Plains. Most headed to California, hopeful, green California, where jobs were supposedly plentiful. They loaded everything they had onto old cars. Beds, chairs, everything tied to the top of the car. A family's entire existence was one automobile. They were called Okies, after those from Oklahoma, but actually used for migrants from the entire region. It was a derogatory term. John Steinbeck's famous novel The Grapes of Wrath told the story of this migration. In the book, the Joad family travels from Oklahoma to California. There is hope, but reality is bitter. Because California wasn't the paradise awaiting them. Migrant camps were established. Thousands lived in tents and shacks. There were jobs, but very few, and wages were extremely low. Native Californians didn't want them. Signs were posted, "No Okies." Discrimination was rampant. But these people had no other choice. Roosevelt and policy footage. The disaster was a national crisis. President Franklin D. Roosevelt had to take action. The New Deal programs launched in 1933 turned their attention to the Dust Bowl. The government made radical decisions. The Soil Conservation Service was established. Scientists and experts were sent to the Great Plains. The problem was analyzed: overcultivation, improper farming techniques, destruction of natural cover. The solution was systematic. First, millions of trees were planted. It was called the Shelterbelt Project. A massive line of trees stretching from North Dakota to Texas. To break the wind, to hold the soil. Second, farmers were taught new techniques. Contour plowing, strip cropping, crop rotation. The soil had to be protected. Third, the government purchased some land. Land unsuitable for farming was returned to natural grasslands. Additionally, farmers received financial support. Job programs were started for the unemployed. These measures were slow but effective. In 1939, a miracle occurred. The rain returned. When they felt the first drops, people wept. Children danced in the rain. The soil drank the water. Crops grew again. Grasslands turned green. Life began to return. But this wasn't just because of the rain. The new farming techniques that had been implemented were working. Trees had grown. The soil was stronger. By the time World War II began, conditions had improved. There was demand for grain again. Farmers were more conscious. They didn't want to repeat the mistakes of the past. But the Dust Bowl left deep scars. Communities had been scattered. Generations had migrated. Thousands had lost their lives. The Great Plains would never be the same again.